Welcome to A Slice of Literature, brought to you by the Alyosha Society, where we are pursuing truth and beauty and goodness through great literature. You may have seen a couple of my Slice of Literature videos, but in this series, what I'm doing is taking a single scene, but in this particular case, more of an aspect of the work of literature. But generally speaking, it's something that's so important or remarkable that it can actually kind of stand on its own. I'll always be providing necessary context, but that scene or aspect could potentially stand all by itself. Now, this video is a little bit different because we're going to be looking at money in the novels of Jane Austen, how to understand it a lot better. So let's dive in. Of course I have visuals. Who asked that? All right, let's get right to it. Okay, so you're looking at the Jane Austen novels, and you see that so and so has 10,000 pounds, or so and so has an income of 400 pounds a year. Well, what does it mean? How do I understand that in modern terms that can give me some kind of context as to the actual economic situation? How do I make sense of money issues in Austen's novels? So what I want to do is I want to begin by just talking about the main ways, or some of the most prominent ways that people earned money. And I'm using, 1800, 1810. Jane Austen was born in 1775. So, she was 25 years old in 1800, 35 in 1810. And, she died at a very young age. So that's the basic time frame I'm looking at. So let's take a look at a few of these. Number one, owning land and leasing the land to farmers. We do that today. You're wealthy enough to own a big fat chunk of land, then you let someone else farm it, and you either charge them rent or maybe a percentage of whatever crop it yields. Okay, that was a very common way to bring in money. But you just sort of naturally had to have already had that wealth. Maybe you inherited the land, whatever the case may be. This is the one that I think is going to be very helpful in understanding some of the particular references in Jane Austen novels. That is, if you had a significant chunk of money, what folks would do was invest it in what was called a government fund, or it's kind of like a bond. We have these today. Buy a government bond for $100, and in 10 years or 15 years or however long, you can cash it in for $200. It just so happens that the government fund around this time was about 5% yield. That's important. Keep that number in mind, a 5%. And again, as far as investing goes, that's not a huge amount. I'm not in the stock market. I don't know a whole lot about the stock market. I'm pretty sure if you were to tell some of your friends who are in the stock market that they can expect a whopping 5% yield, they would not be all that excited about it. But anyway, that was the government fund. Another way would be just go in the military. This was not a huge income. People didn't get rich by going in the military. Another way, if you happen to be a clergyman, generally speaking, what ministers did was they would actually kind of negotiate with the farmers in their particular parish where the church was, and they would sort of negotiate a salary. The minister would receive a tithe based on the agricultural yield of the land in that parish. If that particular income was not enough, it was very common for pastors to teach on the side. We see that in a lot of stories, early, mid-19th century literature. Then you had skilled labor. Again, you had to have the Cartwrights and the blacksmiths and the carpenters and so forth. For females, very, very common, as you know, if you've read any literature of the 19th century, to be a governess, which is sort of like a, live-in homeschool teacher. So those are the various ways that people earned money during this time. There are more. I think this is a pretty good representation, especially when we look at the Jane Austen novels. Okay, now, one of the things to keep in mind when you're reading the Austen novels is there's a distinction often between someone who has a lump sum of money, or someone who's given, either as an inheritance or whatever the case may be, a lump sum of money, as opposed to a per annum, or a certain amount of money per year. Let's take a look at some of the numbers here, and I think this is going to be helpful. So sometimes in Austen, you'll read that someone inherited 20,000 pounds. What does that mean? I mean, $20,000 in modern US dollars is not a ton of money. So what does that mean? All right, just give any examples now, and we're going to do some math in a little bit later. Kind of scary, but just hang on. Other times, you'll see that so-and-so is given a per annum. Okay, let's again, an annual income of some kind. Again, usually when you see that per annum in the Austen novels, it's referring to a 5% yield on that government bond. And in some cases, you'll see some individuals who actually lived off the interest earned in this investment. Now, you'd have to have a huge chunk of money. But here's what you can do. You can, if you're reading a story and you're given some numbers and you're not really sure what they mean, if it says that someone is living on 500 pounds a year, you can just do the math. Okay, and you can do the math and figure out, well, 500 pounds is 5% of what large number, and that'll tell you the big chunk of money that that individual had to invest in the government fund. I'm going to help you out with some of that in just a minute, but just kind of giving you the basics here. Now, this is what you really wanted to know, isn't it? Yeah, I want to compare it to modern day America, or wherever it is you happen to be living. So let's just get some, real life numbers here. 100 pounds a year. Okay, if you were earning or trying to live on 100 pounds a year, that's poverty. There were some government clerks that earned this much. They were probably working multiple jobs. You're not going to support a family on 100 pounds. Time out. Just hang on. For those of you who are getting impatient, I'm going to do the conversion for you in a few minutes. Just hang on. You're not living on 100 pounds a year. 200 pounds a year. Still very frugal. Very frugal. Maybe as a single person, you could squeak by. Even 300 pounds a year, possibly comfortable as a bachelor. But you know what, guys? You're not taking vacations to Disney World if you're making, if you're bringing in 300 pounds a year. No, and definitely still not enough for a married couple, much less a family with children. Okay, let's just keep going. 400 pounds a year. Now, that's getting close to, not quite really to what we would call a comfortable middle-class life in America today, although, that's not an exact apples to apples comparison in many ways to compare 21st century America and early 19th century England, but we'll talk about that in a minute. You may even have a servant or two at 400 a year. Again, you're barely squeaking by. At 500 pounds a year, you might be able to, put food on the table, married couple. And when I say comfortable living here, I don't mean that you have a whole lot of luxuries, because you're not going to have a lot, but you might be able to make it. You might be able to squeak by on 500 a year. Now let's get into the higher level. If you're making if you're making, yeah, let's say around £1,000 a year. That is sort of like the upper middle range. That'd be considered a fairly prosperous family in 1800 in England. Let's keep moving. Let's keep moving now. Now let's put some names on the numbers. 2K pounds a year. There you go. Mr. Bennett, Colonel Brandon. With 2,000 pounds a year, you've got some land and you're living more than a comfortable life. Remember, Mr. Bennett got all those girls to take care of. I mean, who knows? You know, hair dryers and brushes and makeup and all that stuff. Anyway, Colonel Brandon, now the big leagues, okay? The majors, Darcy, Bingley. If you're not familiar with Henry Crawford from Mansfield Park, Rushworth, also Mansfield Park. Rushworth is actually one of the wealthiest guys in all the Austen novels. This is high end. Okay, this is the gated community with the golf course. So 4,000 pounds a year. That's what you might call the good life. Now, how do we make the conversions? All right, finally, what you probably started watching this video to see, the actual conversions. Caveats first. Let me just say that there doesn't seem to be a consensus of all the sources. I'm going to recommend, several books that I've used. At the end, I'm going to recommend those and show them to you. There does not seem to be a totally agreed upon consensus as to what these numbers should be. So keep that in mind. If you start Googling things and looking things up online, you might find some numbers that are a little bit off from these. What I've done here is this seems to be a kind of median range from the research I did. Okay, so these numbers may not be exact, maybe they are, but they're probably close. So here's how I did it. First of all, let's see how much 1 British pound in 1800 would translate over into the 20th century, because we got to wait before we get to dollars, because we got to find out, well, how many pounds? Well, I think it's about 34 pounds. That's how much inflation, happens there in 200 years. All right. Well, for those of you who are, not jet setters and you're not flying into Heathrow often, what does that mean? Well, 1 pound, at least when I did this research, whenever you're watching this video, these numbers are probably not going to be exact, because the value of the dollar and the pound and so forth, the euro as well, it fluctuates. But just bear with me, okay? It's close enough, and it'll still be good for the points I want to make at the end. 1 pound, about $1.50 in terms of US dollars. So in other words, the pound is stronger than the dollar, obviously. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at an example here. Mr. Bingley. You know who Mr. Bingley is. Pride and Prejudice. Marries Jane Bennett. He has 100,000 pounds, which would be 3.4 million pounds, which would be somewhere around $5.1 million. Dude is loaded. Now, time out. Let me just say this also. Some of you look at that and say, 5 million? I mean, that's pretty good, but look at Alex Rodriguez, and look at LeBron James, and look at all these, look at Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. Okay, no. You cannot use those guys as any kind of gauge. These billionaires in our society, these people didn't exist back then. I did some research and found out that there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 billionaires living in the United States right now. Friends, that's not happening in 1800. Maybe there was 1 or 2 guys who were just living in some sort of a completely, off the charts opulence, extravagance. there weren't, the equivalent of that many billionaires then. So a guy who, is bringing in 5.1 equivalent of $5.1 million, he is, he is the Jeff Bezos of his time. He has everything he could ever dream of and then some. Now, if you want to see how to do the conversions, you could go back and look at those jobs I mentioned earlier, 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 400 pounds, and so forth. And if my math is close here, you would multiply those numbers by 51 to get something close to a modern day, American dollar equivalent. Again, give or take. That's the formula. Now, let me give you some examples that may be helpful here. Let's start with an example from Sense and Sensibility. You remember at the beginning of Sense and Sensibility, it's Mr. Henry Dashwood, the patriarch, I guess you'd call him, of the family, has died. And he leaves an inheritance to his son, Mr. John Dashwood, but he had John from a previous marriage, and the three daughters he has are with the Mrs. Dashwood that when the story opens. So they're actually half siblings. That is John with the three sisters. But anyway, doesn't matter. Very common for the patriarch to leave most, if not all, of his inheritance to the son. So John Dashwood, and this is, this will just make you angry. So if you want to get angry, reread the opening chapters of Sense and Sensibility, because John Dashwood and his wife, Fanny, are debating and discussing, well, how much of this money are we going to give to Eleanor and Mary Ann? And they had a younger 13-year-old sister named Margaret. How much money are we going to give them? Well, the original amount they were supposed to give them was 1,000 pounds. 1,000 pounds. Now, Mr. John Dashwood and his wife Fanny talk about it, and they eventually decide, well, let's just leave them 100 pounds. Ooh, wow. Okay. In other words, they're selfish. They're selfish individuals. But in the end, it gets even worse. They decide to reduce it to 50 pounds a year. Friends, this is not a strong income. Okay. That means that the original amount that they were looking at giving the sisters was between, say, 34,000 and maybe 50,000, which I know that may sound like a lot of money to some of you, but for an inheritance, that's not a huge amount of money, especially if the girls had to divide it up. And none of the girls were married at this point. And think about it, you don't really know what your future is going to be if you don't have that financial security as a female of having a male who's going to take care of you. Talk about that more a little bit later also. So this is even not a ton of money, really. But what they eventually decide on is $3,400 a year. But in the end, they actually cut that in half to something around $1,700 a year. Now, friends, I'm a father. I've been married to the same woman for 30 years. I've raised 5 children. $1,700. I don't. Well, that definitely won't last a week. Okay, that's not going to pay the mortgage. That's not going to get you very far. This is a year. So what John Dashwood ends up deciding to leave Eleanor and Mary Ann and Margaret is it's just peanuts. It's just pennies. And I think doing the math here can really help you understand that a little bit better. Let's look at one more example from Mansfield Park. I mentioned earlier, Mr. Rushforth, super wealthy guy. He had originally invested 10,000 pounds. Now, I think if I remember correctly, he'd invested it in land or something like that. But here's what we do know. That the investment yielded a per annum of 600 pounds. All right. Now, What does that mean? Well, do the math. That's actually pretty easy to do. That's a 6% interest rate per year. Again, by modern day standards, investing in the stock market, that's not great, really. But it does tell us this. Here's what it does tell us. If you do the math, that would tell us that Rushworth's original investment was around $340,000. Now, friends, this was just one investment he made. This wasn't the total amount he had. He had more money than this. This was one investment, between $250,000 million. So if you've got that kind of cash on hand to put out there in an investment, he's loaded. He's really loaded. So in that investment, he would have been receiving, again, this is in modern day US dollars, the equivalent of somewhere around $20,000. Now, remember, guys, this is an investment that his money is yielding this yearly income. He's not doing anything to get this $20,000 a year. So hopefully that puts a little bit of that in perspective. Now, what I want to do now is, how is this going to help you better appreciate the Jane Austen novels? Okay, first of all, today we think of, I've got to get good grades in high school. I've got to get a good SAT score, good 1,500. I've got to get in that Ivy League school. I've got to be able to get that big job and work at that big firm to get that high paying job. Did folks make lots of money by getting degrees and high paying jobs in 1810? No. I've already demonstrated the way people really earned money back then. So you got to get that mindset just out of your head. That's just not the way it worked. If not, how did people really have lots of money? Well, friends, like it or not, a big part of it was just inheritance. It's a little bit like the caste system in that, if you start out wealthy, then you're going to continue wealthy unless you just blow it, and your children will as well. But if you start out poor, in the United States today, you hear about the American dream, and you can be dirt poor and work really hard and start your own business. And some people can work really hard and become millionaires, having started from poverty. Many, many, many examples of that. That's not happening here. Okay, it's inheritance. So what does that tell you? When you're reading the Austen novels, when they're talking about two things in particular, marriage and inheritance, they are huge. Again, for a young lady can't just go to college, get a degree, land a big job, get herself an apartment, and make the big bucks like women do all around the world today. No. She had to rely upon marrying someone who would provide her with financial security. That's why you need to not be so hard on Charlotte Lucas. When Charlotte marries Mr. Collins, guys, she had to. She had to marry him. In Pride and Prejudice, I know, nobody wants to marry Mr. Collins, but she was in a vulnerable position, and at least in her mind, and I think it's reasonable to conclude that she just didn't have any other choice in that context. Yeah. So I hope that helps. Again, when you're reading the Austen novels and you see the importance that's placed on, if a parent saying, if you don't do thus and such, or if you decide to marry so-and-so, I'm going to cut you out of my inheritance. Well, hey, look, I know that even today, that's terrible and that can be devastating. It's even much, much more so in England in the early 19th century. So inheritance and marriage carry a much stronger and more significant meaning in terms of being able to survive and make it through life and eat. A couple of books I want to recommend that have helped me. This one's called The Improvement of the, actually, you know what? Let's go back to chat phase here. We don't need to use the slides anymore. This is called The Improvement of the Estate by Duckworth. Okay, it's one. I'm just got some helpful information there. You know, these Cambridge guides, I've found them pretty helpful. And this particular Cambridge Companion to Jane Austen, it's good. It's got a lot of really good articles in it. Another book I picked up years ago, Claudia Johnson, Jane Austen, Women, Politics, and the Novel. Just a few works I'll throw out there that were helpful for me. Well, friends, let me know if this was helpful. What else can I provide? I make these videos just to share my love of literature and to help other folks understand more, because my philosophy as a teacher has always been, you understand better, you enjoy more. So shoot me an email. Love to hear any feedback you have. Bruce@AlyoshaSociety.com.